I'm going to talk a little bit about logic. Okay. Um, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but in Western European culture, we think logic is the be-all and end-all of persuasion. If something's logical, then it must be true. And that may be the case, but that doesn't mean it's persuasive. For instance, I'm guessing that some of you anyway wanted to stay out past curfew at some point in your middle school, high school life, yes?
Yep.
Yep. And you went to mom or dad, you said, hey, just this once, can I stay out past curfew? And mom or dad said, what's the point in having rules if we're going to break them? And you got shut down because you had nothing for that. It doesn't mean you stopped wanting to break curfew. In fact, some of you went out anyway and got caught and got in big trouble. You still wanted to go. That means you weren't persuaded. That means essentially you were bullied. Okay, and I don't think your parents meant to bully you. Logic bullying is what I call it. As was pointed out in Guanu's speech, your brain isn't fully developed for a while. When you're 15, your ability to use logic is not as good as your parents. They used their logic on you, you got smacked down, you ended up probably staying home. Okay? And there are a dozen, I could come up with a 1,000 examples of people who did things because it was logical, but it doesn't mean they actually changed their mind. In fact, Aristotle thought that pathos was the best way to persuade. But in Western European culture, we have changed our minds on that, and the reason we have changed our minds is because of one person, well, and some folks leading up to him, but primarily because of, oh, by the way, has anyone here taken logic yet? Or taken logic in philosophy class?
Taking philosophy.
And they
If I,
covered deductive logic?
if
Yeah.
I end up taking logic, it'll be like mathematical logic. But no, I have not taken logic.
Is there like inductive and deductive logic?
Yeah, okay, you can take a nap. Take a nap. We'll get back to you next time. You should know all of what I'm about to do, so take a nap.
Oh, it's always good to relearn it.
Okay. All right, I'll accept that. The reason that logic dominates in our culture is because primarily of one man, Rene Descartes. Wrote a couple of good, immensely difficult philosophical treatises, one called Meditations, in the early 1600s. He is most famous for one phrase. Does anyone know what it is?
I think therefore I am.
Yep. Exactly. In Latin, and there's a reason I'm doing this in Latin, it's cogito ergo sum. Cogito is I think, the pronoun is in the verb, ergo is therefore, sum I am. If you speak Spanish, that should make some sense to you.
Siento ergo soy.
There you go. And you can see the parallels here. This one statement has been so ingrained in our culture that we don't get how revolutionary it was in its day. But let me tell you first the story of how Descartes got to that revolutionary statement. because he tells us. I'm going to guess that some of you have, most of you by now, have wondered to yourselves, is anything real? Does anything really exist? Is this all just a dream someone's having? Is this maybe, I don't know, something going on in my brain? Is this a board game that somebody's playing? Is anything real? Please don't experiment like that when you're on weed. You will go to very strange places. And if you've done weed, you probably have already asked yourselves those questions. And it gets kind of frightening. You go kind of down that wormhole, and it's like, whoa, this is way too much. And you scramble back up again. Descartes went all the way down. He really went for, how do I know anything exists? And he came up with one premise. He said, essentially, because I am asking the question, do I exist, then I must exist. And starting from that, he proved that everything really exists. In other words, if I start with the idea that I'm asking the question, do I exist? And I assume that proves I exist, then everything else is real. Doesn't sound like much, I know. But it was. How did you know you existed before the early 1600s? Excuse me, early 1700s. I am Descartes, early 1700s. How did you know you existed before that? For most people.
You kind of just assumed it to be true?
Nope. There was a big institution telling you.
Oh, the church.
The church, of course. You existed because you were part of God's plan. To even question that was bordering on sacrilegious. Okay? Catholic Church told you were part of God's plan, therefore you must exist. Okay? And everybody took that for granted. And I want to say here that Descartes didn't understand how far, as amazing a thinker he was, he didn't understand how far this would go, and he died a good Catholic. He is buried in a Catholic graveyard, so I don't want any misunderstandings about that. But essentially what he put out there, and he wasn't quite the first, but he was certainly the first that got a lot of attention. This idea, cogito, therefore I am. Cogito means literally, I reason. This is why I put it in Latin. I think in English has a lot of meanings. It can mean I feel, it can mean in my humble opinion, it can mean maybe. In Descartes' text, it's cogito, I reason, I do logic. Therefore, I am. In other words, human existence was predicated on our ability to do logic, according to Descartes. This spread like wildfire, especially among the elite, but it eventually filtered its way down. By the end of the 1700s, we had a philosophical movement based on it called, and you've heard of it, humanism. The idea that humanity is the epitome of life in the world. That we are the top of it. And we're not a part of it anymore. We are a step above. It is on us. to use the resources of the planet, etc. Humanism. By the early 1800s, we had the products of logic, chiefly engineering. We had the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So we start seeing tech happening. Okay. This goes through the beginning of the 20th century, where we have, because of science, technology, mathematics, or science and technology, the most horrendous wars the world has ever seen. We have, we're going to drop a nuclear bomb because we can, because it's technology. We end up, by World War II, starting to look at the math aspects of all of this with computers. Okay. Our homes become completely engineering, tech-centered, with TVs and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and all tech to make our lives easier. And, until we get to today, and I'm sure many of you who, if you've ever been to a college counselor, has been encouraged to go into fields like science, technology, engineering, math. Okay? This is all because of this concept that it is our logic that justifies our existence. Let's go back one more time pre-Descartes. What were the top fields to be in the Renaissance?
Art and literature.
Absolutely.
Executioner.
Art, performing arts, architecture, literature, the arts. Those of you who are artists, I'm sorry, you were just born 500 years too late. You had your day, maybe it's going to roll back again. But right now it's science, technology, engineering, math. These things change and change with time. But this is why logic is considered in Western European civilization and all societies influenced by Western European civilization as the best way to persuade. Not because it's inherently better, but because it is tied into our own perception of ourselves in the world, that we are logic-doing beings. Okay. After the speeches next time, I'm going to talk a little bit more and in depth about logic, formal and informal, deductive and inductive. But I wanted to set you up for that because there are other ways of thinking besides logic. They are generally dismissed by Western European culture. But I just want to toss them out there quickly before you go. Let's see, if any of you are superstitious, not logical, doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just not logical. If any of you believe in rituals, not logical. Not saying it's wrong. If anybody believes here in herbal medicine, handed down knowledge, stuff you learned from your grandmother, folk knowledge, folk wisdom, not logical. Doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean those herbal medicines don't work. Some of them do. Yeah, but we can't prove it scientifically, so it's not considered as good as the pharmaceuticals. Intuition. Ever had a sense that you shouldn't do something right now? Not logical. All right? But many of you have acted on that feeling. that I really shouldn't do this right now. It doesn't feel right. I could go on and on with these. I will add one to it. It's going to drive some people nuts, which is faith. Faith is not logical. Doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, I'm going to offend some people here, so let me explain in the 2 minutes to 1 minute I got left. Okay? Faith is not logical. Let's look at what Descartes did. Instead of humanity being justified by God, he suggested that we could justify ourselves without God. Okay? Belief in God depends on faith. That is the definition of faith. Faith is believing in something you can't prove. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you can't prove it. I mean, if God walked in this room that I'm sitting in right now, shook my hand, sat down, got on camera with us, you wouldn't need faith anymore. God would be there. Okay? But for those of you with faith, let me warn you, you're not going to win that argument with somebody logically. Those discussions, if you've ever had them, come down always to, you just gotta believe. And you do. It's not logical. You just have to take that leap of faith. Okay? Philosophers for centuries have tried making logical arguments for God. Somebody's always come along behind them and shot down those arguments. There is nothing wrong with any of this stuff. But I will say one thing about them. They don't go in academia. If you have ever been in a class, probably from the 3rd grade on, where you raised your hand and you said, it just doesn't feel right to me, your intuition, you got shot down by the teacher. That's not a reason. No, it's not. In the sense of a logical reason. Okay? All of this stuff that's down here. Okay? Okay? I'm not saying don't believe in it. I will tell you, if you haven't already figured it out, and probably you have, it doesn't belong in the academic world. It's not what the academic world is about. Doesn't mean it's wrong, doesn't mean it's a bad thing, doesn't mean it's not valuable. It is. But the academic world has its boundaries too, and its boundaries today are around logic.